Last week, we talked about navigating bye weeks by looking ahead and identifying potential lineup holes and developing a strategy for managing them. And we even talked about when it makes sense to just simply take a zero. So last week, we talked about buys. This week, we are talking about buys. When to cut bait from underperforming or non-performing players on your roster. Now, I know saying goodbye is never easy, but asking yourself the right questions can help you frame the decision and come to the conclusion that it's not me, it's you. Welcome to Dumpsville on today's episode of Dynasty Compass. Welcome to Dynasty Compass. I am your host, Jeff Blaylock, the other Jeff B. from Footballguys. Thank you so much for listening or watching today. This is our 10th episode, which means that I've outlasted about 90% of all podcasts ever created and probably about 3/4 of all British sitcoms. And I can't do that without you. So thank you. Thank you so much. Let's get into it, shall we? I often talk about strategic directions and how critical they are to decision-making for dynasty managers. The show is called Dynasty Compass, the compass being a metaphor that you use to see where you are, where you want to go, and how to navigate toward it. But it isn't a GPS. It doesn't just give you the right turns to make. It requires you to do your own thinking and go through your own thought process to navigate your destinations. Now, Dumpsville is not one of those destinations. It's just a stop on the wayside. Think about it like taking a cross-country drive and you come across the world's largest corn maze. That's what Dumpsville is. It's a sideshow attraction on the way to where we're going. But for one or more of our players on our rosters, this is where they're going to get off the team bus. There are two kinds of players that I think we're really talking about here when we talk about who we need to cut. The first one is what I would call the diminishing hopeful. This is a player that just simply has not earned a role since they joined their team, either as a rookie or as an acquisition. They've been getting leapfrogged by other players who have joined since. They go back and forth from the practice squad to the active roster, or from one practice squad to a different team's practice squad. These are people who had hopes. We had visions for what they could be when they came into the league, and they just simply haven't gotten there. And the second is what I would call an aging journeyman. These are people who have been with multiple teams over the years. They're getting older. They're veteran players. Their typical ceiling is probably about 7 to 10 fantasy points, unless they just happen to fall into the end zone. And they're always operating at their ceiling, bouncing from wide receiver 3 and wide receiver role from one to the next across the NFL. And when we're looking at our roster, we look at the players that we have, we don't want to be super ruthless and just cut people for the sake of cutting people. That's not strategic. We want to have a strategy in place. And part of that strategy is understanding why we're keeping the player in the first place. And there are 3 traps that we can fall into when we do this. These are psychological things that affect all of us as human beings, and they can become very difficult to get around as a dynasty manager. The first of those is what I would call the sunk cost fallacy. It's another one of those fancy economics words that we apply here in fantasy football. Sunk cost is essentially, what did you spend on this investment in the first place? So if you spent a first-round draft choice on a player, or you traded a productive veteran for this particular player, that was a high cost that you paid for them, but that cost is now irrelevant to any future decision. That investment is gone. We don't need to count that anymore as part of our value calculations. The way I'd prefer to think about it is not what did I pay for him when I drafted him. It is, if I were drafting today, would I spend that same pick on him again? Would I trade that same player for him again? And if the answer is no, then we know that we have a much less valuable asset than what we thought we were getting. The second of the three traps that we can fall into is what I would call wish casting. This is looking only at the best case of what a player might be able to do instead of the likely case of what this player will do. This is particularly critical when looking at developing talents because the talent may not actually be developing the way that we need them to. The question to ask here is, does the likely case, does the thing that's most likely to happen to this player, does that ever get them into our starting lineups? You recall one of the questions that I like to ask is, what does it take for me to put this player into my starting lineup? Well, if all we're looking at is what I would call the likely case, the likeliest outcome of their fantasy production, is that enough to get them into your lineup other than just avoiding a zero, or perhaps they're slightly better than somebody else on the waiver wire? The best case, that's the ceiling. Most likely that gets them into your lineup. If the best case doesn't get them into your lineup, then we know we can cut this player very safely. But when we're looking at the likely case, is that enough to crack the lineup? Kind of along those lines, but a little bit different psychologically, is what I would call the false insurance trap. This is thinking that I need this depth on my roster in case there are enough injuries that I would need to start this person. But the question to ask is, would I start them in any other circumstance than these sort of emergency zero avoidance kinds of situations? And if the answer is no, then that makes them basically indistinguishable from any other player on the waiver wire at any given moment, which means we could pick that player up when we need them and not keep the roster clogged with this player that we might need at some point, but we hold them as an insurance policy, but it's really a false insurance policy. The value is just not there to hang on to them. All three of these traps lead us to keep players for longer than we really need to. But what I like to look at is what I call the GM extension test. This is a rhetorical question that I will ask if I'm looking at a player on my roster and trying to decide, do I want to keep them? Do I not? And this is the way I look at it. If I were this player's real general manager for a real NFL team, would I give him a second contract? Would I extend this player as a veteran? The answer is no. Then the opportunity cost of keeping this player on my roster is probably more than the value of the player himself. And this is an opportunity to say bye-bye. So how do we measure what this realistic outcome is going to be for this player's production? Well, production, of course, is a downstream element of just simply being on the field. If you're not getting snaps, then you're not getting the opportunity to do anything in terms of fantasy production. So I look at snap share. Footballguys, for example, has a terrific tool that will show you the snap share of every player in every game they've played this season. If this player is hovering around 40% of snaps or 20 routes per game across a meaningful stretch, maybe that's going to lead to some fantasy production. But if it's below those targets or it's very infrequent that he hits them, their likely outcome is going to be minimal and not worth hanging on to. We also look at straight up usage, such as how many touches per game are they getting when they are active, when they are playing, how many targets are they getting when they are on the field, and particularly when it comes to backup running backs, backup wide receivers, what does that volume look like when the player that they're supposed to be replacing is out? If it isn't what we think it should be, then these are players that don't have a long-term role on the offense that they're on. They just happen to be the best person available. They are slotted in, but they're not even trusted with the workload or anything close to the workload of the player that they are replacing. If that is the case, then their ceiling is greatly diminished, which probably also diminishes by a little bit more their likely outcome. And it makes this player not particularly valuable. Makes me not want to put him into my starting lineup. And if it's a player that I don't want to put in my starting lineup, I don't need him on my bench. Something else that I like to look for is, did that usage increase or decrease over time or from one season to the next? And was this player leapfrogged by another player that joined the roster later, either a rookie that was drafted the next season or a veteran that was signed as a free agent or brought in as a trade? Did this person get leapfrogged by someone else? That's something else I like to look at. We also need to look at what the coaching situation is around this player. The coaching staff would be responsible for, in conjunction with the general manager, for bringing in this player in the first place. They either drafted him or they traded for him. They signed him as a free agent. If there is a different head coach and general manager combination in place now, they have no loyalty to this player that was picked up by the previous regime. And might make it much easier for them to cut them. Not quite as dire is if we have the same head coach, but a new offensive coordinator. That presents both opportunities and challenges. First is that the opportunity is that a new offensive coordinator might bring in a new scheme that makes this player more relevant to the offense. But then again, they might have a scheme that makes them even more irrelevant to the offense. But the fact that the same head coach is there means they already have a relationship with this player. There may be a trust level with this player, and that might help them to survive the coaching change. And then one of the last things that I look at is just what's the trust level? We just talked about it a second ago with the head coach being there through changes in offensive coordinators. What is the trust that this coach or this offensive coordinator has in this player? If we have drops, if we have fumbles, if we have blown pass protection, what is the coach's reaction to that? Do they send them to the bench for the rest of the game? Do they send them back out there to try to boost their confidence back up and just say it was a bad play? What is the reaction that we get from the coaching staff when this particular player we're looking at doesn't do their job right on the field for a given snap or in a given game? Higher levels of trust mean that a role is going to be more solid. A lower level of trust means it's going to be more precarious. Now, we've just talked about, in terms of opportunity, really applies more to the last two of the three psychological traps: wishcasting and false insurance. The idea that we may be forecasting or looking at a higher level of production or a ceiling that is just not what's going to be achievable or not what a player is going to do. These are probably less strong psychologically than the sunk cost fallacy is. That when we invest heavily in a player, we expect them to succeed, we want them to succeed, and we are less likely to part with them until that value is met. We either have unrealistic expectations for trade value, or we're just simply going to hang on to this player because they have a high draft pedigree and they just might get a chance. Now, the good news for us dynasty managers is that a number of NFL head coaches and general managers also suffer from the sunk cost fallacy, and they want to make sure that their high draft picks are given the opportunities to succeed. And opportunity, of course, means the potential for fantasy production. Now, I wanted to take a look at this because we typically look at a draft class and we select our players, and then they play for a certain amount of time. Some of them take off, some of them do not. But is there a way to tell, or at least a way historically, mathematically, to say at this particular point, the chances are very slim that this player is ever going to take off? So what I did was look at all of the draft classes and the undrafted free agents who've entered the league between 2015 and 2024. And I wanted to do it from a dynasty perspective. I've seen this done a lot from a redraft perspective, where you look to see if a player in their rookie season is top 12 or top 24. Well, in dynasty, those kinds of results would guarantee that they were in your starting lineup. I want to look at the deeper down, the more spots down on the bench, the people who are next man up or developing talent or potentially dart throws as we get farther down the draft chart, and see what their success rate is going to be. So I defined a hit as a top 36 finish as a quarterback, a top 60 finish as a running back, a top 72 finish as a wide receiver, or a top 36 finish as a tight end. So QB3, RB5, wide receiver 6, or tight end 3. Did they do that even once in their careers? And if so, when was that first one? I divided these four positions into four different buckets based on when they were drafted. We have day one selections, which are your first round draft picks in the NFL draft. We have day two selections, which are your second and third round picks. Day three selections are your fourth through seventh round picks. And then undrafted free agents are exactly what they sound like. They are people who were not drafted and were signed as free agents later. Now, in the spring, we'll do at least a whole show or two on this research. But for now, let me hit some of these highlights. Round one players are much more likely to hit than day two players, than day three players, than undrafted free agents. That, of course, makes a lot of sense. The numbers actually do back this up. For example, for running backs, round one running backs since 2015 have hit 100% of the time. The day two running backs hit 77% of the time. Day three, 42% of the time. Undrafted free agents, 25% of the time. Similar scales exist and similar drop downs exist for the other positions. The only real exception is quarterback, where some of the undrafted free agents actually had a higher success rate than your day three quarterbacks, but neither of them was particularly high. Day three was 21%. The undrafted free agents were 33%. But aside from that exception, every round for every position, the success rate drops by between 20 and 30 points every time. So if we're looking at when these players hit, they hit early is the answer. The rookie year hit rates are much higher for the first round than for the second round and for the third round, but they're also much higher from the first year to the second year to the third year. So for example, 77% of round one quarterbacks hit in their rookie year, only 9% in the second year. 61% of wide receivers selected in the first round hit in the first year, only 12% in the second year. Even tight ends, who we acknowledge are typically later in development, 80% hit in the first year, 20% in the second, and that same drop-off continues through each draft cycle in each position, each draft cadre, rather, and each position. So what's important, though, here, when we're talking about Dumpsville and whether we need to drop one of these players off, one of these players we drafted as a developing talent, is who didn't hit at all, or at least hasn't hit yet. There are some players who were drafted only a few years ago. They could conceivably hit later in their careers. When we go farther back, we've pretty much seen what the career of these players is going to be. And the not yet or never hit rates are very, very high if they haven't hit yet by year two. For quarterbacks, that never hits rate is between 75 and 100%. So if they did not hit in the first 2 years, between 3/4 and all of them are not going to hit in the future. For running backs, day one running backs, they all hit by year two, but between 83 and 91% of the rest of them did not. For wide receivers, 70% of them who had not hit by year two in the first round still did not hit. Between 88 and 94% of those selected after that did not hit after the second year. And for tight ends, the same story is there. Between 80 and 93% did not hit after year two. So that means that if you've got a player on your roster who is in his third year in the league, and he has not secured a QB3, RB5, wide receiver 6, or tight end 3 season out of the first two, it's highly, highly likely. 17 out of 18 mathematically are the odds that that person is not going to hit in the future. So you'll be holding on to an asset that has no value, that player is just simply most likely not going to hit. If you had 18 of them on your roster, 17 of them are not going to hit on average. That leaves you with just the one. And that to me is a low enough odd to just cut bait right there. If they're in year three and haven't hit, I think it's time to let them go. There are, of course, exceptions and reasons why we might want to hang on to a player even if they haven't broken out by year two. One of those is just they've had bad injury luck, and that's been fluky kinds of injuries, not repetitive ones. So it's not, say, a Marshawn Lloyd who has had the same kinds of soft tissue injuries for several seasons. It's more just kind of freak kinds of injuries that knock people out for stretches of time, and they just simply have not been able to put a full season together. There's a chance that if they got that full season, they would be able to hit at least a wide receiver 6, running back 5, QB, or tight end 3 level. Second, might just be a situation where the player was brought in and is blocked by veterans in front of them. Isaiah Likely comes immediately to mind for me. He is, by everyone's estimation, the tight end 1 of the future for Baltimore, but Mark Andrews continues to be the tight end 1 of the present. So he is effectively blocked from his full potential by this veteran player. Eventually, the veteran player will move on, and this talent that we have, Isaiah Likely in this example, should be able to move into that top role. So those are a couple of reasons to think about why is this player not hit yet? And that is, in fact, one of our questions that we are going to ask ourselves before we make that cut, before we drop our player off in Dumpsville. And so, being the kind of person who asks more questions than I give answers, let me tell you what the questions are that I will ask myself if I am looking at a player and considering breaking up with him. The first question we've already talked about is, would I start him? What are the circumstances under which I would start this player? What would I expect from them if I were to start them? The lower down on our startability ladder that this player is, the much less likely, obviously, I would start him. The less valuable that he is to me, the more likely I can cut him. We also asked earlier in the show the general manager extension question. Would his general manager extend him in the real NFL based upon the production and the participation on the field that he's seen to this point? What has been the participation rate when they've been on the field? Has this player been earning snap shares and routes and touches and targets? Have these numbers been going up since their rookie year when they first arrived in the team? Are they flat or worse? Are they declining? Are they getting the touches when the player they are supposedly backing up is out? Are they getting some of the same level of touches that makes them insertable into our lineup? If they are not, that probably means that we are able to cut them. We've also talked about, has he been leapfrogged by another player? If they brought in a rookie 2 years ago, he had minimal playing time, and then they drafted someone in the same position a year later, did that second person, that shinier toy, get the playing time instead of the player that we have on our roster? Is their draft pedigree potentially still buying them some chances? Are we seeing a situation where a general manager or a head coach is also suffering from sunk cost fallacy and wants to give this player yet another chance? Or is his best chance being on a practice squad or a third or fourth player on the line in the depth chart on some other team? Breaking up is hard to do, but the opportunity costs of keeping a player too long are real. It means we cannot bring in another player who might be very helpful or very valuable to us because we have got a commitment in our minds to someone who is clogging the roster more than he is helping our starting lineup. You want to forecast the likely outcome, not the ceiling outcome. You want to be looking at the likeliest case of production for this player because wishcasting is going to get your benches clogged. We don't extend bench spots to players that we wouldn't extend in real life. If there's a player that we would not hang on to in real life, we do not need to hang on to them now. So these are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking when it may become time to break up with a player that we've had on our roster for 2 or 3 seasons or even longer. Why are we holding on to this player? I think when we get to the bottom of that answer, we can more realistically determine what our future relationship with this player is going to be. And remember, this is fantasy football. That player is never going to know that you cut him. Not at all. He'll never know. So it's like having to write a Dear John letter that will never be read because the person doesn't even know that you broke up with them in the first place. So this is week 5. We just had week 5 of the NFL season, upcoming week 6. After week 6, that is when I like to start really assessing where my dynasty rosters all are this season and whether or not it's time to change direction, to double down more on the direction that I'm in, or just simply to wait and see what happens, because there may be a number of reasons why what I've seen through the first 6 weeks is not what I'm going to see for the next 8 to 12 weeks. So that will be next week on Dynasty Compass. Again, thank you so much for listening or watching, for giving us good reviews, for sharing us, for telling your friends about us. The more that we can get, the more folks we can get listening to us and watching us, the more that's going to help me be able to continue to provide some insights and some guidance toward dynasty managers as you make your way toward what we hope is ultimately true north, building a contender who is at the top of the standings and vying for championships season after season after season. Thanks so much. We will see you next week.